Silas Crow walked into the Callahan ranch yard like he owned it already. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward. Not how loud he was, not how many men rode in behind him, but how quiet he was when he stepped down from his horse and looked at the house. The way a man looks at something he's already decided belongs to him. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open with 2 fingers, found Graham Callahan sitting at his own kitchen table, and set a single sheet of paper down in front of him. Loan notice, final demand, 30 days. "Sign the land over now," Crow said, "or I'll take it through the court and make sure every rancher in this county knows the Callahans couldn't hold what their grandfather built." Graham's hands were shaking when he reached for the paper. Nobody in that room noticed the woman standing in the doorway to the back hall. Nobody ever did. Her name was Violet, and she read every word on that page before her father picked up the pen. If you've ever been the person in the room that nobody sees, you already know what happened next. Stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what Violet Callahan did next is the kind of thing that doesn't get put in history books. It gets passed down in whispers. Hit the like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The Callahan Ranch sat on 412 acres of Montana grassland that Graham's father had broken from raw ground with a team of oxen and 30 years of his life. The grass was good, the water was reliable, the cattle were lean but healthy. On paper, it looked like a ranch that had everything figured out. It didn't. Graham Callahan had been borrowing against the land for 6 years. Small loans at first, to cover a drought year, to replace a broken well casing, to buy seed when prices jumped. Then the loans got bigger. Then the interest compounded. Then he borrowed from the wrong man to pay back the first wrong man. And by the time Violet was 22 years old, the Callahan Ranch owed Silas Crow's lending company more than Graham would ever be able to repay on cattle income alone. Graham didn't tell his daughters. He didn't tell anyone. He got up every morning, put on his hat, and acted like a man who still owned something. Violet suspected. She had been doing the actual work of the ranch since she was 16, the kind of work that puts you in contact with real numbers, real shortfalls, real consequences. She kept her own ledger. Not because anyone asked her to, because the alternative was not knowing, and not knowing frightened her more than any number could. By the time she was 24, she had a clear picture of the debt. She didn't confront her father about it directly. That was not how things worked between them. Graham Callahan was not a man who received information from his daughters. He delivered it. He decided it. That was the order of things in his house. And Violet had learned early that fighting the order directly got her nowhere. So she worked around it. She found other ways to protect the ranch. Quiet ways. Ways that didn't require anyone to notice her, or thank her, or change their mind about what she was. The water rights agreement was the biggest of these. It had happened 2 years earlier, in the dry summer, when the creek running through the northwest corner of the property had started to run low. The Halverson Ranch upstream had been diverting water for a new irrigation project. It was legal, technically. It was also going to ruin the Callahan grazing land within 3 years if nothing was done about it. Graham didn't know. He was dealing with a sick herd that summer, and he was stressed. And when Violet tried to bring up the water situation at dinner, he told her to stop worrying about things above her station. So she handled it herself. She rode to the county clerk's office in Billings and spent 4 days reading through every water rights document filed in the previous 20 years. She found a filing error in the Halverson diversion permit, a missing survey marker that invalidated their claim to the volume they were taking. She drafted a formal challenge. The county mediator sided with her. The Callahans retained their water allocation. Graham never knew it happened. He thought the water problem had resolved itself, like weather, like luck. Violet filed the agreement in a tin box she kept in her room, along with every other important document related to the ranch: deed copies, tax filings, grazing permits, livestock registration papers. She didn't keep them because anyone told her to. She kept them because she had come to understand, with the particular clarity of a woman who has been overlooked her entire life, that paper was the only thing that couldn't be talked away. Her sister Lydia was 3 years younger and entirely different in the way that certain sisters are. not in a way either of them chose, but in a way the world had decided for them before they were old enough to have an opinion about it. Lydia was pretty in a way that people noticed immediately, the kind of pretty that made men straighten their backs and women calculate. She was kind, genuinely kind, not the performed kind. She laughed easily. She made conversations comfortable. She was the daughter Graham Callahan introduced to people. Violet was the daughter who had kept his ranch from collapsing. She did not spend a great deal of time feeling sorry for herself about this. There were years when she had, years when the unfairness of it sat in her chest like a stone, and she went to bed angry more nights than not. But anger without an outlet either hardens you or hollows you out, and Violet had decided sometime around her 19th year that she would rather turn it into fuel. She worked, she learned, she documented, she waited. She did not know exactly what she was waiting for. She had a feeling, not a plan, not yet, that the moment would come when everything she had quietly gathered would matter. She did not know what it would look like. She did not know when. She just kept the tin box locked and the ledger current, and her mouth shut more than she should have had to. Silas Crow was 51 years old and had the face of a man who had learned that patience was more profitable than speed. He was not physically imposing. Medium height, neat clothing, a voice that stayed low even when he was angry, which made it more unsettling, not less. He had grown up poor in the way that certain men grow up poor and decide, at some young and formative moment, that they will never be poor again, and they don't particularly care what that costs other people. His business model was elegant in the way that traps are elegant. He targeted ranch families with good land but weak cash flow, the kind of operations that had real assets and real value but could not survive a string of bad years. He offered loans at reasonable rates. He was patient while the interest accumulated. He was sympathetic when they fell behind. He restructured the debt in ways that looked like kindness and functioned like a tightening grip. And then, when the moment was right, he collected. He had done it to the Pembroke family 3 years ago. Good people, 400 acres, 2 generations of work. Crow had the land inside 6 months of the final notice. He sold it to a railroad company for twice what he'd paid the Pembrokes in loans and kept his name out of the deal entirely. He had done it to the Whitehill brothers, to the Garner widow, to a small operation up near Havre run by a man named Tatum, who'd believed right up until the end that Crow was going to help him. The Callahan Ranch was next, but Crow had a wrinkle this time that the others hadn't offered. The Callahan family had daughters, and Crow, at 51, had recently calculated that marriage to the right woman from the right family would provide certain legal and social advantages that a simple land acquisition would not. Access to the community, a veneer of legitimacy, the appearance of a man building something rather than a man taking things. He had his eye on Lydia Callahan. He had discussed it with Graham in terms Graham could hear. The debt could be restructured, reduced, in exchange for a formal arrangement between the families. Graham had understood what was being offered. Graham had gone home and thought about it for 10 days before coming back and saying yes. He had not told Lydia. He had not told Violet. He had, in his mind, made a practical decision to protect his family and his land, and he had buried the knowledge of it under the same thick layer of self-justification he used for everything else. He was doing what a father had to do. He was being realistic. He was saving the ranch. These were the things he told himself at night. Violet found out on a Tuesday. She found out the way she found out most things. Not through a conversation, not through anything her father chose to share with her, but through a piece of paper. A letter from Crow's office, confirming the terms of the proposed arrangement. It had been tucked into the ledger Graham kept in the barn office. She'd gone in to pull a grazing record and found it folded inside the back cover. She read it twice. She put it back exactly as she'd found it. She went back to the fence she'd been repairing and finished the last 3 posts before she let herself think about what she'd just read. 2 sheets. The arrangement was this. Crow would reduce the principal on the Callahan debt by 40% and suspend interest payments for 2 years in exchange for a formal engagement between Lydia Callahan and a man named Wyatt Blackthorne. Wyatt was the son of a cattle family, the Blackthorns, who had a business relationship with Crow. The engagement would be announced at the upcoming county gathering. The wedding would follow within the year. Lydia did not know she was being offered. Wyatt Blackthorne, Violet suspected, might not know the full shape of the arrangement either. The Blackthorns were wealthy and legitimate, old cattle money, the kind that came from actual work over actual generations. It was possible that Crow had sold them on this as a straightforward match, the kind of alliance two good families might arrange naturally. It was also possible Wyatt knew exactly what he was walking into. She didn't know enough yet to be sure. What she was sure of, her father had agreed to trade her sister's future for a debt reduction, and he had done it without telling either of his daughters. And Silas Crow, who she had suspected for some time was not the straightforward businessman he presented himself as, was engineering the match for reasons that had nothing to do with Lydia's happiness or even the Callahan family's survival. He wanted an entry point, a family connection that would give him standing in the community, access to the Callahan social network, and eventually, she was almost certain of this, a pathway to the land itself. The engagement was the setup. The marriage would be the mechanism. And somewhere in the fine print of whatever agreement Crow was drafting, there would be a clause or a condition or a technicality that would allow him to extend his control over the property in a way that a simple debt collection could not. She had seen enough of his paperwork by now, through various county records she'd pulled over the past year, to recognize his patterns. He didn't take things head on. He built structures around them until the thing inside had nowhere left to go. Violet spent the next 3 evenings going through the tin box. She pulled out the water rights agreement, the deed copy, the grazing permits, the tax filings for the past decade. She laid them out on her floor after Lydia was asleep, and she studied them the way she had once studied the creek maps before the water rights challenge, looking for the place where the ground was solid, looking for what she had that he didn't. She found something on the 3rd night. It wasn't much, but it was a thread. Wyatt Blackthorne arrived at the Callahan Ranch on a Thursday afternoon in early June, which was a bad time to arrive at any working ranch because every hand was busy and nobody had time for polite introductions. He arrived alone, which surprised her. She had expected his family to send someone ahead or send a group, the kind of arrival that signals power and makes a statement. Instead, he came by himself on a good horse with plain tack, wearing working clothes that had actually been worked in. And he tied his horse at the rail and looked around the yard with the expression of a man who was genuinely trying to get his bearings, rather than one who was trying to seem important. Violet was on the far side of the yard repairing a section of fence that had given way the previous night. She was not dressed for company. She was not, in the way her father understood the term, dressed for anything. She had her hair pinned back under a wide hat, her sleeves rolled past the elbow, and her hands were dirty from working the wire. She watched him over the fence line. He didn't go to the house immediately. He walked around the side of the main barn, looked at the structure, and then his eyes landed on the well casing near the north corner of the yard, a new installation done the previous spring, and he stopped. He crouched down and looked at the casing seam, stood up again. It was a careful, quiet assessment, the kind a person does when they actually know what they're looking at. He finally noticed Violet. She did not put down the fencing tool. She did not straighten up or smile or do any of the things she might have done had she been trying to make a particular impression. "You've got a gap in your east pasture fence," he said, "about 40 yards south of the main gate." "I know," she said. "I'm fixing the north corner first because the north corner has cattle pressing against it, and the east gap has nothing on the other side worth worrying about yet." He considered this for a moment. "That's reasonable." She turned back to the wire. "You're looking for my father or my sister." "I was going to say hello to whoever answered the door," he said, "but nobody answered the door." "Lydia's in town. My father's in the south pasture." She glanced back at him. "The house is unlocked. There's water in the kitchen." He didn't go inside. He stayed where he was, looking at the fence work she was doing, and after a moment he said, "Is that the standard gauge for this region? The wire?" She looked at him more carefully now. "No," she said. "It's heavier than standard. The standard gauge breaks in hard winters." "Who made that call?" "I did." He nodded, very slightly, in the way a person nods when they've received information that adjusts their picture of a situation. Not a performative nod, an actual one. "The well casing," he said. "The seam work is different from what I usually see." The usual contractor does it wrong, she said. I found someone out of Billings who uses a double seal method. It costs more up front. It doesn't fail. He was quiet for a moment. Your name is Violet, he said. Yes. I was told... He stopped. She set the fencing tool down and looked at him directly. What were you told? He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. That Graham Callahan had a daughter who managed the household, and a daughter who ran the ranch. Violet picked the tool back up. Which one did you think you were talking to? He didn't answer that immediately. She gave him credit for it, for not reaching for the easy, safe response. I'm starting to reconsider my assumptions, he said finally. She didn't smile, but something in her chest shifted, just slightly, in a way she didn't have a name for yet and wasn't sure she trusted. Graham came in from the south pasture at sundown and found Wyatt Blackthorne sitting on the porch steps, which was not the ceremonial welcome Graham had planned. He'd planned a proper introduction in the front room, Lydia in a decent dress, the impression of a prosperous and orderly family. Instead, Lydia wasn't back from town yet, and his eldest daughter was still in the yard pulling wire, and Wyatt was sitting on the porch eating an apple he'd apparently helped himself to. Graham shook his hand with a smile that cost him something to produce. I apologize for the state of things, Graham said. We've been short-handed this week. Don't apologize, Wyatt said. I've been having a useful conversation with your daughter. Graham glanced toward the yard. Something crossed his face that Violet, watching from a distance, read without difficulty. It was not pride. It was not exactly embarrassment. It was the particular expression of a man who has just been reminded of something he preferred not to think about. Violet keeps herself busy, Graham said. The way he said it, the tone, the dismissal built into the word busy, made the thing in Violet's chest shift again. Not the uncertain thing from earlier, something older and harder. Something she'd been carrying since she was 16 years old. She turned back to the wire and finished the corner in the last of the fading light. Dinner was the first time Lydia and Wyatt were in the same room, and it did not go the way Graham had hoped or Lydia had expected or Violet had anticipated. Lydia was warm and natural and not uncomfortable, because Lydia was rarely uncomfortable in social situations. She asked Wyatt about his family's operation in a way that showed genuine curiosity rather than performed interest. He answered her without condescension. They had a reasonable conversation about cattle prices and the difficulties of the past 2 winters. Violet ate and said almost nothing. What she was watching was not the conversation. She was watching Graham, the way her father positioned himself at the head of the table with the air of a man running a negotiation, the way he steered the conversation toward the Blackthorne family's resources, their reputation, their connections, the way he looked at Lydia when Wyatt was speaking, not like a father watching his daughter, but like a man watching an asset perform. And she was watching Wyatt. Wyatt, who glanced at Violet twice during the meal when she hadn't said anything, who seemed, faintly, to be tracking her silence the way you track the absence of a sound you were expecting to hear. After dinner, when Graham and Wyatt moved to the front room to talk, Violet stayed in the kitchen with Lydia and helped clear the table. He seems decent, Lydia said. He does, Violet said. Lydia looked at her. Lydia had always been better at reading Violet than most people were. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Violet. She set down the plate she was holding. She wanted to tell her sister. She wanted badly to tell her exactly what was in that letter. But she needed to know more first. She needed to understand the full shape of what Crow was doing before she put anything into Lydia's hands that Lydia might take to their father and blow the whole thing apart too soon. I'm just tired, she said. Lydia accepted this. Because Lydia was kind, and because Violet had been saying I'm just tired as a cover story for a decade, and it still worked. After Lydia went upstairs, Violet stood at the kitchen window for a long time. Outside, the yard was dark. The cattle were quiet. The north fence was solid. She thought about the thread she'd found in the documents. She thought about what it would take to pull it without the whole arrangement collapsing in the wrong direction. She thought about Wyatt Blackthorne's face when he realized he might have been measuring the wrong Callahan daughter. She thought about the tin box, Then she went to her room, unlocked it, and started reading again. 2 days later, Wyatt found her at the water well in the north yard. She was checking the flow rate, a seasonal measurement she did 3 times a year to track any change in the water table, and she was so focused on what she was doing that she didn't hear him come up until he was already there. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She straightened up. "You can ask." He was direct about it, which she appreciated. He didn't circle around. "The water rights for this property, the creek allocation out of the northwest corner. How did that get settled?" She looked at him steadily. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I looked it up," he said. "Before I came here, I looked up the county records for this property. The original filing challenge on the Halverson diversion was filed in your father's name. But the document language, the specific argument about the survey marker, isn't something most ranchers would know to look for." She didn't say anything. "It isn't something my father would know to look for," Wyatt said, "and he's been in the cattle business for 40 years. She held his gaze for a long moment. "My father filed it," she said finally. "Who found the argument?" The silence between them stretched out. A horse shifted in the nearby corral. The wind moved through the grass. "I did," she said. He exhaled slowly. Not surprise exactly. Confirmation. "Does your father know that?" "No." "Does he know what would have happened to the grazing land if the Halverson diversion had gone through?" "He knows the water problem resolved itself," Violet said. "He believes it was luck." Wyatt was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was careful. "How long have you been managing things this way?" "What way?" "Doing the work and letting him believe it happened on its own." She set the flow measurement aside. "Since I was 16. He didn't say anything immediately, and she watched him process that. She braced herself for sympathy she didn't want, or worse, the particular kind of pity that comes packaged as admiration. Instead, he said, "That must be exhausting." It wasn't what she expected. It was so close to the truth that it caught her off guard. "Yes," she said, and she was almost surprised to hear herself say it plainly. "It is." He looked out across the north pasture for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "I want to ask you something else," he said. "Then ask it. What do you know about Silas Crow?" And there it was. Violet looked at him for a long moment. The wind picked up slightly, and the grass beyond the fence moved in a slow, wide wave. She had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for this exact question, not from this exact person, but from someone who might actually be on the right side of it. She picked up the flow measurement notebook. "Come back after supper," she said. "Come alone." She walked back toward the barn without waiting to see if he would agree. Behind her, she heard him say quietly, "All right." The thread she'd found in the tin box had just found something to pull against. He came back after supper, like she'd asked. Violet was already at the small table in the tack room off the main barn. Not the house, not anywhere her father might wander through, with the tin box open and 3 documents laid flat in front of her. A lantern burned low on the shelf above. Outside, the last of the day's light was draining out of the sky, and the cattle had gone quiet in the pastures. Wyatt ducked through the low doorway and looked around the tack room the way he'd looked around the yard when he first arrived, taking stock without performing the act of taking stock. He saw the documents. He saw the box. He pulled over the spare stool without being invited and sat down across from her. "You said you looked up the county records before you came," Violet said. She didn't preface it. She'd been thinking about this for 2 hours, and she was done with preambles. "I did." "Then you know the Callahan property has a loan balance with Crow Lending." "I knew there was some financial arrangement," Wyatt said. "My father mentioned it when he told me about the visit. He said Crow had introduced the idea of a match between our families." "Your father knows Crow well?" Wyatt's expression shifted slightly. "They've done business together, cattle contracts mostly. My father thinks Crow is a sharp businessman who plays close to the edge of what's polite but not past it. What do you think?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think I came out here to meet a family before I made any decisions, and I think what I've found in the past 2 days has made me want to look harder at the shape of this whole arrangement." Violet turned one of the documents around so he could read it. It was the letter she'd found in her father's ledger. The arrangement terms: debt reduction in exchange for the engagement announcement. Wyatt read it carefully. He read it the way people read things when they're not skimming, going back, rereading certain lines, tracking the language. When he looked up, his face was composed, but something behind his eyes had tightened. "He didn't tell Lydia," Violet said. "No." "Did you know the specific terms of this?" "No," Wyatt said. "I knew my family had agreed to a visit. I was told there was a daughter—" He stopped, started again. "I was told it was a straightforward introduction." Crow arranged it. "Yes." "Why would Crow care about your family's involvement in a match between our families?" Violet let that sit for a beat. "He's a lender. He's not a matchmaker." Wyatt set the letter down. "What are you telling me?" She slid the second document across to him. This one was a county record she'd pulled 3 weeks ago. A land title transfer from 4 years prior. The Pembroke property. 412 acres, same as the Callahan land, sold to a land-holding company called Meridian Cattle Works 18 months after the Pembroke family had taken out a loan from Crow Lending. "Meridian Cattle Works," she said. "Look at the registration filing for the company." He scanned to the bottom of the document. The registered agent was a law firm out of Helena. It took him a moment, and then she watched him find the name she'd found. Silas Crow was listed as a silent partner. Wyatt looked up at her. "He makes the loan," Violet said. "He lets it compound. He engineers a situation. Sometimes it's a bad year. Sometimes it's something he helps along, where the family can't pay. Then he acquires the property through a company that doesn't have his name on the front door. And the Pembrokes sold their land at a loss to pay the debt. They moved to Billings. The father died 2 winters after. I don't know where the family is now." She said it without inflection, but it cost her something to say plainly, the way honest things usually do. "He's done this to at least 3 other families that I can document, possibly more." Wyatt was silent. Outside, one of the horses in the corral moved, hooves against dry ground. "The engagement arrangement," he said slowly. "Lydia. What does he actually get out of that?" "I've been thinking about it since I found the letter." Violet pulled the third document forward. This one was a copy she'd made of a property law summary she'd found at the county office. The kind of legal document that nobody reads unless they have a reason to. In Montana territorial law, a formal engagement between 2 parties where one party holds a registered financial interest creates what's called a family lien provision under certain debt instruments. It's obscure. Most people don't know it exists. Wyatt frowned. "What does it do?" "If the engagement is announced publicly and the debt isn't resolved within the announcement period, Crow could argue that the Blackthorne family, through the engagement, has assumed a partial financial responsibility for the Callahan debt. It would give him a legal basis to pull your family's assets into a collection action." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones that had come before it. "That's," Wyatt started. "It's a trap," Violet said, "for your family, not just mine. He doesn't just want the Callahan land. He wants the Blackthorne connection to add legitimacy to his operations. And if he can engineer a situation where your family is legally exposed through the engagement, he's got leverage over you as well." Wyatt stood up. He didn't go anywhere. The tack room wasn't large enough for pacing. But he stood up with the particular restlessness of a man who has just understood something he very much wished he hadn't needed to understand. "Your father doesn't know any of this," he said. "My father believes Crow is offering him a genuine way out of the debt. And Lydia doesn't know she's been offered to anyone." The word offered came out harder than she'd intended. She didn't soften it. Wyatt looked at her steadily. "How long have you known?" "About Crow's pattern, I've been piecing it together for about a year. The specific terms of the arrangement with your family, I found the letter 4 days before you arrived." 4 days. He sat back down. "And you didn't go to your father?" "I went to my father with the water situation 2 years ago," Violet said. "He told me to stop worrying about things above my station." Something moved across Wyatt's face. Not pity. It was closer to the expression of a man doing a specific and uncomfortable recalculation. "What do you need from me?" he said. It was the right question. She'd been braced for the wrong one. For him to tell her what she should do, or to take the documents and say he'd handle it from here, or to look at her with that particular male uncertainty that meant he was deciding how much of what she was telling him to actually believe. He asked what she needed. She pulled the tin box closer. I need access to your family's records of the business dealings with Crow, contracts, correspondence, anything with dates. I think if I can cross-reference them with the county records I already have, I can establish the pattern clearly enough to take to a lawyer. A lawyer. Not a local one. Someone out of Billings or Helena who doesn't owe Crow anything. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. My father trusts Crow. I know. Convincing him to hand over business records on the basis of, he'll want more than my word on this. Then we get him more? Violet said. I'm not asking you to go to your father tonight. I'm asking you to not go back to him and report this conversation. I'm asking you for time. He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light wasn't particularly flattering to anyone, and it didn't need to be. This was not that kind of moment. How much time, he said. Until the county gathering. That's 6 weeks. Crow wants the engagement announced at the gathering. I know, Violet said. That's why 6 weeks. Tuck. She didn't sleep that night. Not really. She lay in her bed listening to the ranch settle around her. The creak of the walls, the distant sound of the cattle shifting. And she thought about all the ways this could go wrong. She thought about her father finding out she'd been talking to Wyatt behind his back. She thought about Wyatt deciding she was either wrong or not worth the risk and going to Crow directly. She thought about Lydia, who still didn't know, who would eventually have to be told, and what that conversation was going to look like. She thought about the Pembroke father who'd moved to Billings and died 2 winters later. She thought about the 412 acres her grandfather had broken from raw ground. She was not afraid exactly. She was something that lived close to fear without quite being it. A state of heightened attention that she'd learned over years of managing problems nobody else wanted was more useful than either calm or panic. It kept her sharp. It kept her honest about what she didn't know. What she didn't know yet. Whether the documents she had were enough, without Wyatt's access to the Blackthorn Crow correspondence, to make a case that any lawyer would take seriously. She'd built a pattern from public records, but Crow was careful. He kept his name off the front of things. The Meridian Cattle Works connection was the strongest piece she had, and even that required an argument that a hostile audience could dismiss as coincidence. She needed the Blackthorn records. She needed Wyatt. She had no particular reason to trust him yet, beyond the fact that he'd asked the right question and hadn't reached for the documents and said he'd handle it. That was more than most men had given her. She told herself it would have to be enough for now, and spent the remaining hours before dawn going through the county records she hadn't cross-referenced yet. The next morning, Graham announced at breakfast that Silas Crow would be visiting the ranch in 10 days' time. He said it the way he said most things he'd already decided. Not as a proposal, not as information he was sharing for input. As a fact. Crow was coming. There would be dinner. The house should be presentable. Lydia looked up from her coffee. What for? Business discussion, Graham said. Nothing to worry about. Violet watched her sister's face. Lydia was not a stupid person. She'd picked up over the past few days that something about Wyatt's visit was not entirely what it appeared to be. She hadn't pushed at it directly because Lydia had her own ways of navigating their father, and direct confrontation was rarely one of them. Will Mr. Blackthorn still be here? Lydia asked. Graham looked slightly uncomfortable. He's expected to stay through next week, yes. Will Mr. Crow be joining us for dinner as well, all together? There was a pause. Yes. Lydia picked up her coffee cup. That should be interesting, she said, in a tone that was perfectly neutral and therefore not neutral at all. After Graham left the table, Lydia looked at Violet. Tell me what's actually happening, she said. Violet set down her fork. She had known this moment was coming. She had been running through versions of it since finding the letter. Not yet, she said. Violet, I need a few more days. When I tell you, I want to be able to tell you everything, not just part of it. Lydia held her gaze. Her younger sister had the ability, when she chose to use it, to look at a person with an attention that was hard to meet. Is it bad? Lydia said. Violet didn't lie to her. She had never been able to lie to Lydia, specifically, though she'd managed it with nearly everyone else in her life without much difficulty. "Yes," she said, "but I'm working on it." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "Is Wyatt Blackthorne part of the problem or part of the solution?" "I don't know yet," Violet said honestly. "I think maybe both." Wyatt did not approach her that day, or the day after. He spent time with Graham, which was presumably what he was supposed to be doing, looking at the cattle operation, discussing the ranch, performing the role of a young man considering an alliance. Violet watched them from a distance when their paths crossed, and noticed that Wyatt was doing something she hadn't expected. He was asking Graham real questions, not the polite questions of someone filling time, questions about the grazing rotation, the winter water plan, the long-term soil quality on the south pasture. Graham answered them with the authority of a man who believed he knew his operation, and some of what he said was accurate, and some of what he said was outdated information that Violet had updated years ago without telling him, and none of it was technically wrong enough to contradict in public. On the third day, Wyatt found her mending harness in the main barn. He sat down on the workbench opposite her without being invited, and was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he'd been thinking about something and had arrived at a conclusion. "I wrote to my brother," he said. She kept working the needle through the leather. "Not your father." "My brother Caleb manages most of the day-to-day correspondence for our operation. He's more likely to have access to the Crow documents without making it a larger conversation than it needs to be right now." "When will he respond?" "He's in Miles City. A week, maybe." A week was tight with 10 days until Crow's visit, but it was better than the alternative. "Wyatt." She stopped working the harness and looked at him directly. "Why are you doing this?" He met her eyes. "Because if what you showed me is accurate, Crow is planning to use my family the same way he used the Pembrokes, and I'd rather find that out now than after the announcement." "That's a practical reason," she said. "Yes. I'm asking if there's another one." He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, quiet in the way of a person deciding how honest to be about something. "Because you've been holding this ranch together for 8 years, he said, "and you did it alone, and nobody in your own family has the first idea. And that strikes me as both impressive and genuinely unfair, and I find that I'm less interested in looking away from it than I probably should be." She didn't know what to do with that. She had gotten, over the years, very good at setting aside things she didn't know what to do with and coming back to them later. She picked the harness back up. "The letter your brother sends," she said. "Have him use plain language. If Crow has someone watching your family's mail, and I wouldn't rule it out, I don't want anything in writing that lays out what we're looking for." "You think he's watching our mail?" "I think he's careful," Violet said. "I think he's been doing this long enough to be careful in ways most people don't think to be." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "You think like someone who's been fighting uphill for a long time." "I've been fighting uphill for a long time," she said. It wasn't bitterness. It was just accurate. Crow's visit arrived before Wyatt's brother's letter did, which was not ideal. He came in the early afternoon on a Thursday, and he did not come alone this time. He brought 2 men who were introduced as associates, but who did not speak and positioned themselves near doorways, which was a particular kind of message. He was polite at the door. He shook Graham's hand with both of his. He said the ranch was looking well and meant it to sound like a compliment, and managed to make it sound like something slightly else, like a man noting that the property was in adequate condition for his purposes. He did not look at Violet when Graham introduced her. That alone told her a great deal. Men who underestimated women usually made a show of it, however unconscious. A glance that slid past too quickly, a greeting that was technically correct and somehow still dismissive. Crow did none of that. He simply excluded her from his field of attention entirely, the way you exclude a piece of furniture. It was practiced. She had the feeling he'd learned somewhere along the way that women who felt unseen were women who weren't watching you. He was wrong about Violet, but he couldn't have known that. They ate dinner. Crow was charming across the table in the way that people are charming when they have decided the outcome of a conversation before it begins. He talked about the cattle market. He asked Wyatt about the Blackthorne operation in terms that established their mutual acquaintance without revealing its depth. He talked to Lydia about the upcoming county gathering, asked her what she was most looking forward to, and listened to her answer with the focused attention of a man who has learned that making women feel heard is useful. Lydia was pleasant and non-committal. She had a gift for this, for giving a person the sensation of connection without actually giving them anything. Violet ate and watched and said almost nothing. After dinner, the men moved to the front room for the business portion of the evening. Violet and Lydia were, in the understood language of the house, not part of that. She helped Lydia clear the table. She carried dishes to the kitchen. And then, while Lydia was at the wash basin with her back turned, Violet slipped out the side door and moved quietly around the exterior of the house to the window of the front room, which was open 2 inches against the evening heat. She stood against the wall beneath the window and listened. Crow's voice was low and reasonable. He was discussing the debt structure. He was discussing the announcement at the gathering. He used the word opportunity 4 times in the first few minutes, which was more than any honest man needed. Then she heard him say something that sent a cold line of clarity down the center of her chest. "The Blackthorn Association will satisfy the lien provision requirement," he said. "Once the announcement is made publicly, I'll file the amended debt instrument the following week. Graham, you'll see the reduction in your principal as agreed. And Wyatt, your family's involvement in the filing is purely procedural. It simply satisfies the legal framework for the restructuring, nothing more." He was explaining the trap to both of them, wrapped in the language of procedure and paperwork. Graham said, "That all sounds straightforward." Wyatt said nothing for a moment, and then he said carefully, "I'll need to have our family's lawyer look over the amended instrument before we sign." A pause. "Of course," Crow said. The warmth in his voice didn't change. "Standard practice. I'd expect nothing less." But something had shifted in the room. She could hear it without seeing it. She moved away from the window before anyone came out. Later that night, after Crow's wagon had rolled out of the yard and Graham had gone to bed looking satisfied with himself in the way of a man who didn't understand what he'd agreed to, Violet found Wyatt sitting on the porch steps. He'd heard her approach and didn't look up right away. He was holding a glass of water he hadn't drunk. "You were at the window," he said. "Yes." He looked up at her. "You heard what he said about the lien provision." "He told you both exactly what he was doing," Violet said. She sat down on the step below him and turned so she could see his face. "Not in terms anyone would recognize as a confession, in terms that sounded like a procedure." "My father will sign it," Wyatt said. "If I don't stop it, my father will read that amendment and see a routine restructuring and sign it." "Then you have to stop it." He set the glass down a seat. "I need that letter from Caleb." "I know." "If it doesn't come in time, then we work with what we have," Violet said. "But Wyatt, even if it comes, even if we have the correspondence between your family and Crow, that alone isn't enough. He's too careful. The documents need to establish a pattern across multiple families. They need to tell a story that a lawyer can take to a judge. The Pembrokes, the others you mentioned. I need to make contact with them, with someone who'll talk." She had been thinking about this since the previous week, and she'd been reluctant to follow it through because it meant going beyond documents, beyond county records, into the actual human wreckage that Crow left behind. It meant finding people who had lost things they couldn't get back and asking them to revisit it. It was the part of this she least wanted to do. "I know where the Whitehills ended up," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "How?" "My brother mentioned them in a letter about 6 months ago. He'd run into Daniel Whitehill in Miles City. Apparently he's been looking for someone to help him build a case against Crow for 2 years. He just didn't know who to trust." The thing in Violet's chest did something she didn't have a clean name for. Not relief, exactly. Something more complicated. The feeling of a person who has been working alone for a very long time discovering, very suddenly, that she doesn't have to. She didn't let it change her expression. "Write to your brother," she said. "Tell him to find Whitehill. Tell him not to use Crow's name in the letter. I'll ride to the telegraph office in the morning. It's faster." She nodded. The night was quiet around them. The stars were clear, and the grass out past the fence line moved in a slow, dark wave. "Violet," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "When this is over, however it ends, your father is going to find out what you did, what you've been doing." She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it every time she'd pulled a document from the tin box. Yes. Are you prepared for that? She was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was complicated. She had spent so long managing her father's blindness, working around it, protecting the ranch in spite of it. She genuinely did not know what it would feel like to step out from behind that arrangement. She did not know if what Graham Callahan would feel upon learning the truth would be gratitude or something else entirely. She suspected something else. I'm prepared for the ranch to survive, she said. What comes after that, I'll handle when it gets here. He nodded slowly. It was an honest answer, and he received it as one. She stood up from the step. Get some sleep, she said. We've got work to do before that gathering. She walked back inside without waiting to see what his face did. Behind her, she heard him pick up the glass of water and drink it. Small things. She noticed small things. She always had. It was, she thought as she climbed the stairs, one of the better qualities she'd developed in a life that hadn't offered her many obvious advantages. The tin box was on her desk where she'd left it. She sat down, opened it, and started building the case. Caleb Blackthorne's reply came 5 days before the county gathering. Wyatt brought it to her in the barn at mid-morning, folded twice and slightly damp at the corner where he'd been holding it too tightly. She could tell from the way he handed it over that he'd already read it twice and was still deciding what it meant. She read it standing up, which was how she read most things she needed to assess quickly. Caleb had found Daniel Whitehill. The man was in Miles City working day labor at a freight yard, living in a rooming house 2 blocks from the rail depot. He was 43 years old and looked 60, according to Caleb. And when Caleb mentioned the name Silas Crow, the man had gone so still and so quiet that Caleb had spent a full minute wondering if he'd said something wrong. Then Whitehill had talked for 4 hours. He had documentation. Not as organized as Violet's, nothing like her tin box. But he had kept a handful of papers from the period before the Whitehill brothers had lost their land, including a loan amendment that contained language nearly identical to what Violet had found in the county records for the Pembroke transfer. He had a letter from Crow's office that referenced, in terms that could only be read one way once you understood the pattern, the Meridian Cattle Works Holding Company. He had a name Violet didn't have yet, a lawyer in Helena named Reginald Marsh, who Crow used for the transfer filings. The same lawyer had appeared in the Pembroke transfer, the Garner widow's property transfer. Every one of Crow's acquisitions that Violet had been able to trace ran through Marsh's office. She folded the letter and handed it back to Wyatt. Whitehill will testify, she said. Caleb says yes. He says Whitehill's been waiting 2 years for someone to ask him. She walked to the barn door and looked out at the yard. 10 days since Crow's visit. 5 days until the gathering. Her father had been in a better mood than she'd seen him in years, which was the particular cruelty of a man who believed his problems were resolving themselves. Lydia had stopped asking questions and started watching instead, which was in some ways more worrying. The gathering is Saturday, Violet said. Crow expects the announcement Saturday evening. Yes. We need the confrontation to happen before the announcement. Once it's public, the lien provision activates. And even if we expose him afterward, your family is still technically exposed until the legal argument unwinds. That could take months. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. You want to do it at the gathering itself. I want to do it in front of every rancher and landowner in this county, Violet said. Not because I want the theater of it, because Crow's power here depends entirely on people not knowing what he's doing. The moment they know, the moment the Pembroke story and the Whitehill story are public, in a room full of people who have all borrowed money or signed contracts at some point in their lives, he loses the one thing he can't replace. His reputation? His access, she said. Without access to families who trust him, he has no mechanism. He can't run this scheme without the trust of the community. That's what we take. Wyatt leaned against the barn door frame. He'll deny it. Let him. I'll have the documents. She turned to look at him. I need your family's records of the correspondence with Crow. The specific letters Caleb has access to. Can he get them here before Saturday? He can ride out Friday morning if he leaves Miles City tonight. Tell him to bring everything, every letter, every signed agreement, every document that has both your family's name and Crow's on it. Wyatt pushed off from the doorframe. I'll telegraph him now. He was already moving toward the door when she said, "Wyatt." He stopped. "Your father is going to find out through this, not before it," she said. "I can't give you a version of this where he has time to prepare. If we warn him in advance, there's too much chance it gets back to Crow." He absorbed this. His jaw was tight in the way of a man swallowing something that didn't go down clean. "He's going to be angry," Wyatt said. "Probably. Not at Crow. At first he's going to be angry at me." "Probably," Violet said again. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded and walked out. She told Lydia that night. She'd put it off as long as she could justify, and she couldn't justify it anymore. If Saturday went wrong, if something she hadn't accounted for collapsed the plan, Lydia deserved to know what had been done in her name, what their father had agreed to. She waited until the house was settled and Graham's lamp had gone out, and then she went to Lydia's room and sat on the edge of the bed and told her everything. All of it. The letter, Crow's scheme, the Pembrokes, the Whitehills, the lien provision, what she and Wyatt had been doing for the past 2 weeks. Lydia listened without interrupting, which was how Lydia listened to things that mattered. She sat up straight against the headboard with her hands folded in her lap and her face doing very little. And Violet watched her sister process information the way she'd watched her do it since they were children. Not fast, not dramatically, but completely. When Violet finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. "He agreed to it," Lydia said. Not a question. "Papa agreed to offer me to Crow's arrangement without telling me." "Yes." "How long has he known the ranch was in this kind of debt?" "I think years. I think he's been managing it in pieces for a long time." Lydia was quiet again. She looked at her hands. "And you've been managing it too," she said, "without him knowing." "Yes, the water rights. And other things. The tax filing error in 2019 that would have cost us the North Pasture. I caught that and fixed it before anyone else saw it. The grazing permit renewal that lapsed, I caught that too." Lydia looked up at her. In the low light, her face was composed in the way of a person holding something heavy, very carefully. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. It was a fair question. Violet had expected it, and she still wasn't entirely sure she had a satisfying answer. "I kept thinking there would be a right moment," Violet said, "and the right moment kept not being here." "You didn't want to worry me." "I didn't want to pull you into something I wasn't sure I could manage." "Violet." Lydia's voice had a particular quality to it. "I have been watching you carry this house for 8 years. I am not fragile. I know you're not. You do not act like you know that." The words landed cleanly and without cruelty, which made them land harder. Violet looked at her sister. "No," she said. "I suppose I don't." Another silence, a different kind than the ones before it. "What happened Saturday?" Lydia said. "We expose him publicly. At the gathering, before the announcement. And if it doesn't work? Then I figure out what went wrong and I try something else." Lydia looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" Violet felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not relief, something less certain than relief, but pointed in the same direction. "I need you to act normally until Saturday," she said. "I need Crow to believe everything is on schedule." "I can do that." "It means being cordial to him if you see him before then." "I can be cordial to people I despise," Lydia said. "I grew up in this house. I've had practice." Violet almost smiled. Lydia reached across the space between them and put her hand over Violet's on the quilt. Her hand was smaller and softer, and the grip was surprisingly firm. "Don't do this alone," Lydia said. "Not this part." Violet turned her hand over under her sister's. "I'm not," she said. "Not entirely." The 4 days before the gathering were the longest of Violet's life, and she had lived through long days. She continued her work on the ranch as though nothing was different. She repaired fence, she checked water levels. She helped move a section of the herd to the east pasture. She did all of this with the surface attention of a person going through familiar motions and the beneath surface attention of a person running calculations at every available moment. She went over the documents obsessively, not because she didn't have them memorized, she did, but because each time she read through them, she was looking for the argument against her own case, the place where Crow's lawyer would push back. the gap in the chain that a hostile judge could use to dismiss it. She found 3 weaknesses. She worked on answers to all 3. The biggest weakness was timing. The Pembroke land transfer had happened 4 years ago. The White Hill loss was 2 years ago. A lawyer defending Crow could argue that these were historical transactions with no bearing on the current Callahan situation, that even if the pattern was troubling, there was no evidence of specific wrongdoing in the current debt arrangement. She needed something current, something that tied Crow's actions in the Callahan situation directly to the pattern she'd documented. She found it on Wednesday, 2 days before the gathering, in a document she'd had for weeks without understanding its significance. It was a routine county filing, a registration update for Meridian Cattle Works, the holding company that Crow used for land acquisitions. She'd pulled it as background material and filed it without looking at it closely because it appeared to be an administrative update. But when she read it again on Wednesday night, she saw something she'd missed the first time. Meridian Cattle Works had been updated to add a new registered property interest. The address listed was in the Callahan County District. The property dimensions in the filing were 412 acres. The filing was dated 3 weeks ago. Crow had registered the Callahan property as a Meridian Cattle Works holding before he'd even filed the amended debt instrument, before the engagement announcement had been made, before any legal transfer had occurred. He had put the Callahan land in his company's filing as though he already owned it. Violet sat with that document for a long time. It was either the most damning piece of evidence she had, proof that the Callahan acquisition wasn't a future possibility Crow was working toward, but a transaction he'd already decided was complete, or it was a filing error that a good lawyer could explain away in 10 minutes. She decided it didn't matter which one Crow's lawyer tried to argue. Either way, a county judge was going to want to know why a man who claimed to be a simple lender had registered property he didn't own in his private holding company 3 weeks before the debt was due. She put it at the front of the stack. Caleb Blackthorne arrived Friday evening, later than expected, his horse blown and his expression carrying the particular tightness of a man who'd ridden hard and was preparing for a difficult conversation. He was younger than Wyatt by 2 years, broader through the shoulders, and where Wyatt was careful with his silences, Caleb was careful with his words. He used fewer of them, and each one landed with a specificity that told you he'd thought before he spoke. He handed Violet a saddlebag with a short nod. 11 letters, he said, 3 signed agreements, and White Hill's documents. He sent them with me, copies. He kept the originals. White Hill didn't come? He'll be there tomorrow. He said he needed a day to get ready. Caleb paused. He hasn't spoken Crow's name out loud to anyone but me and Wyatt in 2 years. He needed a day to get himself to the place where he could do it in a room full of people. Violet understood that. She nodded. Your father's inside? Caleb said. Yes. Wyatt told me what he knows, about the arrangement, about what Crow told our father. His voice was flat and even. Our father doesn't know yet that I rode out here. I know. He's going to be at the gathering tomorrow. I know that too. Caleb looked at her steadily. He had the same quality Wyatt had, the ability to look at a thing directly without flinching away from what he saw. You're planning to do this in front of him. I'm planning to do this in front of everyone, Violet said, including your father. Yes. He's not going to like it. No. She met his eyes. But he's going to be standing in a room where Crow's arrangement gets announced publicly, and he's going to be one signature away from being legally exposed. If you'd rather he be warned first, no, Caleb said. No, I've thought about it. If we warn him, he goes to Crow. He doesn't mean to, but he will. He'll want to resolve it quietly, and Crow will know we're coming. He exhaled. I just wanted to say it out loud, that I know what's being asked. I know what's being asked too, Violet said. He nodded once. All right. He handed over the saddlebag fully. What do you need me to do tonight? They worked through most of the night. Violet and Wyatt and Caleb around the small table in the tack room with every document laid out, and the lantern burning high, and the ranch quiet around them. Lydia appeared at 11 o'clock with coffee she'd made without being asked, set it down, and pulled up a stool and stayed. Nobody suggested she leave. Violet built the argument aloud while Caleb and Wyatt cross-referenced the Blackthorn correspondence against her county records. The pattern was even clearer with the business letters in the picture. There were 2 letters from Crow to the Blackthorn family that referenced the lien provision mechanism in language that only made sense if you understood what it was designed to do. In isolation, they read as routine financial procedure. Alongside the Pembroke and Whitehill documents, they read as a template. At 2 a.m, Caleb put his finger on one of the letters and said, he used the same phrase, word for word, in the Whitehill documents. Violet pulled the Whitehill copies out, laid the 2 letters side by side. The restructuring mechanism will be satisfied upon public registration of the familial arrangement. Same words, same order, different family, different year, same trap. The room was quiet for a moment. That's not coincidence, Wyatt said. No, Violet said. That's a form letter. The county gathering was held at the Fenwick property, which had the largest barn in the district and a yard big enough to hold 200 people comfortably. By mid-afternoon on Saturday, it held closer to 300. Ranchers, merchants, wives, children, the sheriff's deputy from town, 3 county commissioners who came every year and spent most of their time talking to each other. Violet arrived with her family. Graham was in his good clothes and his best mood, the mood of a man who believed he was about to resolve a long and difficult problem. He shook hands with people he knew and introduced Wyatt to people who hadn't met him yet with the proprietary ease of a man who had arranged something to be proud of. Lydia was cordial and pleasant and gave away nothing. Violet stayed close to the edge of things and watched. She spotted Crow arriving at 2:30 with his 2 associates and with a man she recognized from his county filing signature as Reginald Marsh, the Helena lawyer. Marsh was older, heavy-set, carrying a leather document case. His presence meant Crow intended to execute the amended debt instrument at the gathering, not just announce the engagement. He was moving faster than she'd expected. She found Wyatt near the water trough at the edge of the yard. Marsh is here, she said quietly. Crow's brought the documents to sign tonight. Wyatt's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. He wants to lock it in before anyone can push back. Yes, which means we have less time than I thought. She looked across the yard to where Crow was making his way through the crowd, shaking hands, laughing at something someone said. Performing. Where's Whitehill? He was here when I arrived. Wyatt scanned the crowd. There, near the fence. She found him. A man standing slightly apart from the main group, thinner than she'd expected, with the careful stillness of someone who has learned to make themselves unobtrusive. He caught her looking and didn't look away. The county commissioner, she said. Hartwell, is he here? I saw him earlier. Find him. Bring him to me before the evening program starts. Tell him you have a legal matter that requires his attention before any documents are signed tonight. Wyatt looked at her. He's going to want to know what kind of matter. Tell him it involves a county filing that may constitute fraud. That word. She had not said it out loud until that moment, not even in the tack room the night before. She'd thought it. She'd built the entire case around it. But saying it aloud was different. Wyatt held her gaze for a moment. Are you sure about tonight? I'm sure that if we don't do it tonight, Crow signs those papers and your family's on the hook for a debt that isn't yours, and my father loses this land inside a year. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. The noise of the gathering moved around them. Voices, children, the distant sound of a fiddle tuning up. No, she said honestly. I'm not sure, but I'm doing it anyway. He nodded. He went to find Hartwell. She crossed the yard to where Daniel Whitehill was standing. He watched her come with the expression of a man who has been told something is going to happen and is still not entirely sure he believes it. Mr. Whitehill, she said, I'm Violet Callahan. I know who you are. His voice was rougher than she'd expected. Caleb Blackthorn told me about you. Then you know what I'm planning to do tonight. He told me. Whitehill looked out across the gathering. Somewhere in the crowd, Crow was still working the room. I told my brother not to fight it, Whitehill said quietly. 2 years ago, when we were losing the land, I told him there was no point fighting men like that. They had too many lawyers and too much money, and we didn't have anything. He paused. I've thought about that every day since. What changed? He looked at her directly. Someone decided to fight. Violet held his gaze. I need you to be willing to stand up in front of this room and say what happened to your family. In your own words. I'll present the documents, but documents don't have faces. People need to see a face. Whitehill was quiet for a long moment. She could see it cost him something. Not the courage exactly, but the reopening of something he'd spent 2 years trying to get distance from. My brother had to move his family to Wyoming, Whitehill said. His oldest boy was born on that land, 4th generation. He paused. Yeah, I'll stand up. Commissioner Hartwell was a practical man in his 60s who had spent 30 years watching people try to resolve things informally that should have gone to court, and things go to court that should have been resolved informally. He had the expression of a man who had seen enough to not be easily surprised and enough to not easily dismiss things either. He stood with Violet and Wyatt near the entrance to the barn, away from the crowd, and he read through the documents she gave him in silence. It took him 12 minutes. When he looked up, his face was composed. The Meridian filing, he said. The one with the Callahan acreage. Dated 3 weeks ago, Violet said. Before any debt resolution or property transfer. I'm aware of what it predates. He looked at her steadily. Where did you get these? County Records Office, public filing, and documents provided by families who were directly affected by these transactions. Whitehill is here? Yes. Hartwell was quiet for a moment, looking down at the stack of papers. He was not a man who processed things outwardly, which she found easier to deal with than men who performed their deliberation. If I move on this tonight, he said, Crow's lawyer will argue that this is a private financial dispute being aired in a public forum without due process. Crow's lawyer is here to sign documents that will legally entangle the Blackthorne family in a fraudulent debt instrument, Violet said. The moment he does that, the harm extends beyond my family. You have an obligation to prevent a fraud from being executed in your county. Hartwell looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. How old are you? He said. 24. He looked back at the documents. Your father knows you're doing this? No? He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. All right, he said. I'll give you the floor before the program starts. 5 minutes. I won't need 5 minutes, Violet said. Crow found her before she found him. She was carrying the document stack toward the barn entrance when he appeared at her left shoulder with the quiet precision of a man who moves through crowds without being tracked, and she stopped herself from reacting because reacting would have told him things she didn't want him to know. Miss Callahan, he said. His voice was even, pleasant, but something behind his eyes was reading her the way he'd been reading her family's land, with the attention of a man calculating what he's about to acquire. Mr. Crow, she said. He looked at the documents under her arm, just briefly, the way a careful man notes something without appearing to focus on it. Your father was looking for you, he said. I believe the evening program is about to begin. I know, she said. I'll be there. He held her gaze for a moment. He was very good at this, at applying pressure through stillness, through the unbroken quality of his attention. You've been busy this past week, he said. I'm always busy, Violet said. You'd know that if you'd looked. Something shifted in his face. Not much. A tightening at the edge of his composure. Careful, Miss Callahan, he said quietly. Careful, she said, just as quietly, is what I'm best at. She walked past him into the barn. The fiddle player had stopped tuning. Commissioner Hartwell was moving toward the front of the room. The crowd was drifting in from the yard, the way crowds do when something is about to start, drawn by the particular change in energy that precedes a public moment. Violet moved to the front of the room. She found Wyatt there already, and Caleb and Lydia standing 2 steps behind with her arms at her sides and her face composed in that specific way she had, and Daniel Whitehill moving in from the side with the careful deliberateness of a man who has made his decision and is not going to revisit it. She looked out at the room. Her father was 20 feet away, near the center of the crowd, and he had just seen her standing at the front with a stack of papers in her hands, and his expression was the one she had expected and still wasn't fully prepared for. Confusion, then the beginning of something that was either anger or fear, which in Graham Callahan had always looked roughly the same. Hartwell raised his hand and the room settled. Before we begin the evening program, Hartwell said, I've been asked to hear a matter of county concern. It involves documentation that several residents believe requires the community's awareness before any formal agreements are executed tonight. He paused. Violet Callahan. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the name that's said is not the name anyone expected. Violet stepped forward. She looked out at the 300 people in front of her, ranchers and their wives and their families, people who worked land the way her grandfather had worked it, people who had, at some point in their lives, taken out a loan or signed a contract or trusted a man with a warm handshake and a voice that stayed reasonable even under pressure. At the far side of the room, Silas Crow stood still. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she looked back at the room. My name is Violet Callahan, she said. My family has 412 acres of Montana land that my grandfather broke from raw ground. Most of you know the ranch. Some of you know my father. She held up the documents. What none of you know, what I didn't know until recently, is what's been happening to this land and to the lands of the Whitehill family and the Pembroke family and the Garner widow over the past 4 years at the hands of a man who has been standing in rooms like this one and shaking hands and calling himself a businessman. Nobody moved. I have the documents, she said. I'm going to show you all of them. The room stayed quiet in the way that only happens when 300 people are holding the same breath. Violet had thought, in the days leading up to this moment, that she would feel something dramatic when she finally stood here, fear or resolve, or the particular clarity that people described when they talked about moments of no return. What she actually felt was a steadiness that had no name she knew, the same steadiness she felt when she was working a problem that mattered. Her hands were not shaking. Her voice, when she spoke again, was level. She laid the first document on the table that Hartwell had positioned at the front of the room. This is a registration filing for a company called Meridian Cattle Works, she said, filed with the Montana Territorial Records Office. The registered silent partner is Silas Crow. She moved to the next document. This is the land title transfer for the Pembroke property, 412 acres in this county, sold 4 years ago at a loss to satisfy a debt owed to Crow Lending. The acquiring company was Meridian Cattle Works. She placed them side by side. Same man, different name on the door. She heard the shift in the room. Not noise, almost the opposite. The particular silence of people recalibrating. The Whitehill property, she continued, placing the next document. 2 years ago. Same structure. Loan from Crow Lending. Default engineered through a combination of compounding interest and an amended debt instrument that restructured the principal in a way that made repayment mathematically impossible within the given timeline. Transfer to Meridian Cattle Works. She paused. Daniel Whitehill is in this room. He can speak to what his family lost and how it was taken. Whitehill stepped forward from the side of the room. He didn't speak immediately. He looked out at the people around him, some of whom he clearly recognized, old neighbors, men he'd done business with, and he took a breath that was visible from the front of the room. We had that land for 3 generations, he said. His voice was rough but steady. My father's father broke it. When we lost it, my brother's boy saw he was 11 years old. He asked me why we had to leave. I didn't have an answer for him that didn't make me ashamed to say out loud. He stopped. I've got an answer now. Nobody in the room moved. Violet let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. Then she lifted the Meridian filing with the Callahan acreage listed on it. This document was filed 3 weeks ago, she said. It is a registration update for Meridian Cattle Works. The property listed in the update, 412 acres in the Callahan district, is my family's land. She held it up so the room could see it. My family still owns this land. No transfer has occurred. No judgment has been entered. But Silas Crow has already registered it as a holding of his private company. The silence broke. Not into chaos, into the specific noise of a large group of people beginning to talk to each other, the low, urgent sound of people confirming with the person next to them what they believed they had just heard. Violet had expected this, and she waded through it, standing at the front with the documents in her hands, watching the room. She was also watching Crow. He had not moved from his position at the far side of the barn. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his face doing very little, and the two associates flanked him at the distance of men waiting for a signal. Reginald Marsh, the lawyer, had the document case pressed against his chest with both hands and was leaning slightly toward Crow in a posture that communicated urgent consultation without allowing any actual words to pass between them in public. Crow's composure was intact. She had known it would be. A man did not run a scheme like this across multiple families over multiple years without developing the ability to remain still when the ground shifted under him. He raised his hand. Hartwell, who had been watching from the side, said, "Mr. Crow." Crow moved through the crowd with the unhurried ease of a man who has not yet conceded that the situation is outside his control. He came to stand at the front of the room, perhaps 6 feet from where Violet was standing, and he looked at her with the expression of a man correcting a misunderstanding. "Commissioner Hartwell," Crow said, "I appreciate the concern being expressed here, but what this young woman has presented is a collection of public documents taken out of context and assembled in a way designed to imply a pattern that doesn't exist." He was addressing Hartwell, but his voice carried to the whole room, and he knew it. "The Meridian filing is an administrative error. My lawyer is prepared to document that. The Pembroke and Whitehill transfers were lawful debt resolutions, documented through proper legal channels, with the full knowledge of the parties involved." He turned slightly to include the room. "I understand why a story like this sounds alarming, and I understand that Miss Callahan is in a difficult position, with her family's finances under strain. But presenting speculation as evidence does a disservice to everyone in this room who has done legitimate business in this county." He was good. She had known he was good. The room had shifted again, not back to his side, but into the uncertain middle ground where people who'd been alarmed start to wonder if they've been hasty. Violet picked up the letter. "Mr. Crow," she said, and her voice came out even, "can you explain why the restructuring language in the amended debt instrument you presented to my father, word for word, is identical to the language in the Whitehill debt amendment and the correspondence you sent to the Blackthorne family?" She held up 2 letters, one in each hand. "The restructuring mechanism will be satisfied upon public registration of the familial arrangement," she read. She looked at the first letter. "This is from the amended instrument you gave my father, dated 6 weeks ago." She looked at the second. "This is from correspondence your office sent to the Blackthorne family, dated 4 months ago." She looked at the Whitehill copies on the table. "Mr. Whitehill has documents from 2 years ago with the same language." She put both letters on the table. "You use the same words," she said, "because it's the same trap." The uncertain middle ground in the room collapsed. Crow's composure held, but something underneath it had changed. She could see it in the way he adjusted his weight, a small shift, not enough for most people to notice. She noticed. "These are standard legal phrases," he said. "Any lender uses similar language across similar instruments." "Mr. Crow." That was Caleb Blackthorne, speaking from the back of the room. He came forward as he spoke, and the crowd parted for him in the way crowds part for a man who moves with purpose. "My family has been doing business with you for 3 years. My father thinks well of you." He stopped near the front of the room and looked at Crow directly. "I pulled our correspondence last week. I want to ask you directly what the lien provision clause in our family's engagement involvement means, in plain language. Not legal language. Plain language." Crow looked at Caleb with the expression of a man managing an inconvenience. "Caleb, this isn't the appropriate setting." "We're all ranchers," Caleb said. "This is exactly the appropriate setting. The lien provision. Does it create a legal liability for my family?" Caleb said, "in the event that the Callahan debt is not resolved within the announcement period?" A beat. "It creates a procedural framework. Yes or no, Mr. Crow?" The room was absolutely silent. Crow looked at Caleb for a long moment. His lawyer had moved forward a step, and Crow held up a single hand that stopped the man in place. "The legal instrument has provisions," Crow said carefully, "that may, in certain circumstances, involve the co-signing family in a dispute resolution process." "That's not a no," Caleb said. It wasn't, and every person in the room understood that it wasn't. Reginald Marsh chose this moment to speak, which was either a tactical decision or a mistake, and it turned out to be the latter. "Commissioner Hartwell," Marsh said, stepping forward with his document case, "I must object to this proceeding on the grounds that it constitutes an extrajudicial interference with a private contractual matter. Any claims Miss Callahan is making about these documents require proper legal examination, not a public forum." Hartwell looked at him. "You're welcome to object, Mr. Marsh. The Callahan debt isn't what I'm concerned about at this moment," Hartwell said. "What I'm concerned about is the Meridian filing." He looked at Crow. "That filing lists property that does not belong to your company, property for which no transfer has been executed and no judgment exists. Mr. Crow, I'm going to need an explanation for that filing that doesn't involve the word administrative." Crow's jaw was tight. "I've told you. You've told me it's an error," Hartwell said. "What I'm asking is how that error was made. What process results in a man's holding company filing a registration claim on land he hasn't acquired?" The room waited. Marsh put his hand on Crow's arm. "A brief contact, the kind that communicates stop talking more clearly than words." Crow stopped talking. That silence was, Violet thought, the clearest thing he'd done all evening. Spot. Graham Callahan had been standing in the middle of the crowd since Violet began speaking, and she had been aware of him the entire time, the way you're aware of a sharp thing near your hand, peripherally, constantly, without looking directly. She looked at him now. He was a big man, her father. Not tall, but solid, the build of a man who'd worked physically his whole life. He was standing with the particular stillness of someone who has received information that has not yet finished arriving, the first impact already there, the full weight of it still coming. He was looking at the documents on the table, not at Crow, not at Violet, at the documents as though looking at them long enough might rearrange what they said. He had not known. She was certain of that, watching him now. He had not known the full shape of what Crow was doing. He'd believed it was a debt resolution. He'd believed the engagement arrangement was transactional, but honest. He was not a malicious man. He was a man who had made decisions under financial pressure without understanding what was behind the hand that was offering to help him. That didn't make what he'd done with Lydia acceptable. It didn't make 8 years of not seeing what Violet had been holding together acceptable. But she understood, watching his face, that he was not a villain in this. He was a man who had been managed the same way Crow managed everyone, except that the person who'd finally seen through it was his own daughter, and he hadn't known that either. She turned back to Hartwell. "I'd like to enter all of these documents into the county record," she said, "formally, tonight. And I'd like to request that the amended debt instrument Crow's lawyer brought here to execute be reviewed before any signatures are collected." Hartwell nodded. "Mr. Marsh, I'll be taking that document case." Marsh looked at Crow. Crow said nothing. Marsh handed over the case. What followed was not clean. It was not the tidy resolution that stories sometimes described, where the villain admits defeat gracefully and the good people leave with everything restored. It was a room full of 300 people, half of whom were talking at once, and a county commissioner trying to establish order, and a lawyer who kept interjecting procedural objections that nobody was in the mood to hear, and Silas Crow standing at the far side of it all with the expression of a man revising his calculations. 2 of the ranchers in the room, brothers named Aldrin, who Violet knew only by sight, came forward and said they wanted Hartwell to look into a loan they'd taken from Crow Lending 4 years ago that had terms they'd never fully understood. A woman near the back asked in a carrying voice whether the Garner widow could get her property back, and Hartwell said he couldn't answer that tonight, but it would be investigated. Crow's associates had moved to flank him more closely. They weren't doing anything overtly threatening. They were simply present in the particular way of men whose job is to make options available. But Hartwell had caught it, and he stepped close to the sheriff's deputy, who'd been standing near the barn door since the evening started, and said something quietly, and the deputy straightened up and moved to a position that made certain geometries of exit less convenient. Violet stood at the front of the room and held the remaining documents and let the noise run through its course, because that was what noise did if you didn't try to fight it prematurely. Wyatt came to stand beside her, not close enough to be conspicuous, just present. "How are you doing?" he said quietly, underneath the noise of the room. Ask me in an hour, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. Your father is coming. She had been expecting this. Graham Callahan crossed the room toward her with the particular movement of a man who is not certain what he's going to say when he arrives, which was unusual for him. She had almost never seen him uncertain about what he was going to say. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the documents in her hands. He looked at her face. How long? He said. Have I known about Crow specifically? About 6 weeks. No. His voice was rough. How long have you been managing things? On the ranch. She held his gaze. Since I was 16. He looked away. Not at anything in particular. Just away, with the expression of a man doing a calculation that keeps coming out to a number he doesn't want. The water rights, he said. Yes. The tax filing. The year we almost lost the North pasture. Yes. I thought... He stopped. I know what you thought, she said. Not unkindly, just honestly. He was quiet for a long moment. Around them the room continued its noise, its arguments, its reckonings, but this particular 6-foot circle of space felt very still. The thing with Lydia, he said. The arrangement. She knows, Violet said. I told her. Something crossed his face that she didn't have a clean name for. It was not a simple emotion. It was the kind of expression that happens when a person confronts, all at once, several things they'd been avoiding separately. I thought I was doing what needed to be done, he said. I know you did. That doesn't... He stopped again. His hands at his sides were very still. That doesn't make it right. No, she said. It doesn't. He nodded. It was a small, effortful thing. He didn't apologize. She hadn't expected him to. Not tonight. Not standing in the middle of a room full of people with everything he'd believed about himself recently rearranged. She had not expected this conversation to fix anything. She had only expected it to be the beginning of something that was a long way from finished. It was. Messy. Crow tried to leave. It was Caleb who noticed first. The quiet movement toward the barn entrance. Marsh close behind with the document case that Hartwell had returned to them while his attention was elsewhere. Caleb put his hand on Wyatt's arm and said something Violet couldn't hear across the room, and Wyatt turned and saw it and moved without hesitating. He crossed the room in 8 strides and got to the barn entrance ahead of Crow's associates. He didn't block the door physically, he just stood in it, with the unhurried quality he'd had since the first day he arrived at the ranch, and he looked at Crow and said, loudly enough for the people nearest them to hear, Commissioner Hartwell asked for your availability until this matter is resolved. The room noise dropped again. Crow stopped. He looked at Wyatt with an expression that had shed most of its warmth. I am not under any legal obligation to remain... Marsh started. No, Hartwell said, arriving at the entrance with the deputy 2 steps behind him. But I have a county filing with your client's name on it that describes property he doesn't own, and I'd like a formal explanation before anyone leaves this gathering. That's not a request I'm making as a social courtesy. The deputy moved to stand beside Wyatt. The geometry of the doorway had changed. Crow's associates looked at him. He looked at Marsh. Marsh, who had spent his career filing transfers and collecting fees and staying comfortable on the right side of powerful men, did something that Violet had not predicted. He set the document case down. He set it down on the hay-strewn floor of the Fenwick barn, and he stepped back from it and he said, in a voice that had gone flat, I need to speak to Commissioner Hartwell separately. Crow looked at him with the full weight of a man who has just understood that the nearest exit has closed. Tuan. What Marsh said to Hartwell privately in the small room off the main barn, Violet did not hear directly. She heard it afterward through Wyatt, who heard it from Hartwell's deputy, who was present. Marsh had been filing the Meridian transfers for 4 years. He had believed, initially, that they were legitimate debt resolutions. He had not looked closely enough, or had chosen not to look closely enough, which amounted to the same legal exposure. The Meridian filing with the Callahan acreage had alarmed him when Crow sent him the instruction to file it. He had filed it because he was afraid not to. He was more afraid now of what happened when a judge looked at his signature on 4 fraudulent property transfers. He gave Hartwell names, dates. the specific location of the company's operating records in Helena, in exchange for cooperation. Violet was not in the room when this happened. She was standing outside the main barn in the cooler air of the evening, holding the tin box she'd brought from the ranch, which she'd given to Hartwell, along with copies of every document. She had kept copies of the copies. She was not the kind of person who handed over her only evidence of anything. Lydia found her there. Her sister came out of the noise of the barn and stood beside her without saying anything for a moment. The sky above them was clear and enormous, the way Montana sky is at night, a weight of stars that didn't care about any of what was happening below it. "Marsh is talking," Lydia said. "I heard." "What does that mean for us?" "It means Crow loses the leverage of a lawyer who'll file whatever he tells him to." Violet looked up at the sky. "The debt challenge will take months. Hartwell can file a county injunction against the Meridian claim on our land in the next few days. That stops any transfer action while the investigation runs. The principal amount will be contested in court based on the fraudulent instrument structure." "Months," Lydia said. "Yes." "Will we keep the land during that time?" "The injunction protects us while the case is active. Yes." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "And Crow?" "That depends on how much Marsh gives them and what the Helena records show." Violet looked at her sister. "He won't be doing this to anyone else in this county. That much I'm certain of." Lydia nodded. She reached out and put her arm through Violet's the way she'd done when they were children, her hand wrapping around Violet's elbow. It was such an old gesture that it landed differently now than it would have even a week ago. "You should have told me sooner," Lydia said. "About all of it." "I know. I mean the ranch, not just Crow. The years of it." Violet was quiet. The cold air moved across the yard and the sounds of the gathering inside were muffled and distant. "I didn't know how," she said. It was the honest answer, and it was not a sufficient answer, and she knew that. "You could have tried," Lydia said. "Yes," Violet said. "I could have." They stood there for a while, not saying anything else, which was its own kind of saying something. Quote, "The formal arrangements took the rest of that night and most of the following week. Hartwell filed the county injunction on the Callahan land by Monday. He filed a formal inquiry request to the Helena Territorial Court on Tuesday, referencing the Meridian transfers and Marsh's cooperation statement. The Blackthorne family lawyer arrived from Miles City on Wednesday and reviewed the full document set and said, with the particular understatement of a man who rarely raised his voice, that this was the most clearly documented case of systematic lending fraud he had seen in 20 years of territorial practice. Crow did not flee, which surprised some people and did not surprise Violet. He was not the kind of man who fled. He was the kind of man who lawyered up and stalled and looked for the gap in the argument that would let him reframe everything. He hired 2 lawyers from Helena and issued a written statement through them calling the proceedings a mischaracterization of legitimate business practice driven by a family in financial distress. The statement was published in the county newspaper. The county newspaper also published, the following week, a full accounting of the Meridian filing, the Pembroke transfer, the White Hill loss, and the names of the other families Hartwell's investigation was looking into. The editor was a man named Clement Boose, who had been ranching in this county since before Violet was born and did not particularly care for men who built wealth by destroying the people around him. The story spread through the district the way things spread when they confirmed something people had half suspected and couldn't name until now. The Aldrin brothers came forward formally with their loan documents. 2 other families followed. The Helena investigation expanded. Wyatt's father, Edward Blackthorne, arrived the Thursday after the gathering. He was not what Violet had imagined. She had built a picture from what Wyatt had said, a man who trusted Crow, who would be angry at the public exposure, who would need convincing. What walked into the Callahan yard that Thursday morning was a man in his early 60s with the weathered face of someone who had spent a lifetime outside and the specific expression of a man who had spent the past 5 days realizing he'd trusted the wrong person. He shook Violet's hand when Wyatt introduced her. He held it a moment longer than a formal greeting required. "My son tells me you built this case across 6 weeks from county records and a tin box," he said. The tin box was already full, Violet said. It had been accumulating for 2 years. Edward looked at her for a moment. How much of our correspondence with Crow were you working with? What Caleb sent was enough to establish the pattern. And if he hadn't sent it? I would have found another way, Violet said. The Meridian filing and the White Hill documents were strong enough to start the process. Everything else strengthened the argument. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ranch around them, the yard, the fences, the cattle, visible in the near pasture. Your father, he said. Is he? Inside, she said. He's expecting you. Edward nodded. He started toward the house, then stopped. Wyatt said you did this primarily to protect your family's land, he said. But you also protected mine. The lien provision would have caught your family, she said. I couldn't expose Crow without exposing that. That's a practical answer. It's an accurate one. He looked at her steadily. Do you have a less practical one? She thought about it for a moment. About the Pembroke father who'd moved to Billings and died 2 winters later. About Daniel Whitehill's face when he'd said my brother's boy asked me why we had to leave. About the shape of what Crow had built, which only worked because people didn't see it until it was too late. No one should lose land like this, she said, to a man like that, using tools that most people don't know to look for. She paused. I knew to look for them. I couldn't not use that. Edward Blackthorne looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and went inside to find her father. Graham Callahan's conversation with Edward Blackthorne lasted 2 hours. Violet did not know what was said. Lydia, who passed the study door twice on errands, reported that the voices were low and the tone was serious, and at one point she was fairly certain she heard her father say something that might, in a man less practiced at emotional inaccessibility, have sounded like an apology. She did not push at this. Some things had to be allowed to work themselves out at their own speed, in rooms she wasn't in, between people figuring out what they still owed each other after a very difficult week. She was in the barn, going through the water rotation schedule for the upcoming month, when Wyatt found her. He came in out of the afternoon light and sat down on the workbench the way he had the first time, in what felt like a different era entirely, and was quiet for a moment. Our fathers are getting along, he said. Lydia told me. Your father asked mine to help put together a joint approach to the county lawyer on the debt challenge. He paused. That surprised me. He asked for help when the alternative is losing something he built, Violet said. He's not entirely incapable of it. He just prefers not to need it. Wyatt was quiet for a moment, turning something over. What do you need now? She looked up from the rotation schedule. What do you mean? I mean the immediate crisis is contained, he said. The injunction is filed. The investigation is running. Crow isn't going to execute any transfers while the county and the territorial court are both looking at him. He held her gaze. You've been running at a full sprint for 6 weeks. I want to know what you need now that you have a moment to draw breath. It was an unusual question, not because it was difficult, because it was so direct that she didn't immediately have an answer, which was itself unusual. She generally had an answer for things. She put the rotation schedule down. I need the debt resolved, she said. Properly. Not restructured in a way that recreates the problem in 5 years. Actually resolved. That's for the land. What do you need for yourself? She looked at him for a long, flat moment. I genuinely don't know, she said. It came out more honestly than she'd planned. I've been focused on the ranch for so long that the question doesn't have a quick answer. That's fair, he said. He didn't push past it. She was grateful for that. The water rotation schedule needs updating, she said, picking it back up. Can I help? She looked at him. He was not performing helpfulness. He was asking a plain question about a practical task. Do you know anything about water rotation schedules? Less than you, he said, but I can read and I can take notes, and I'm reasonably good at following someone who knows what they're doing. She slid the schedule across to him. Start from the top, she said. Tell me what you don't understand. He picked it up and started reading. Outside, the afternoon light was long and golden across the pasture, and the cattle were moving in the unhurried way they moved when the day was settling, and the ranch was still 412 acres of Montana land that Graham Callahan's father had broken from raw ground with 30 years of his life. It was still standing. For now, that was enough. The territorial court hearing was scheduled for the second week of October, which gave Violet 6 weeks to do what she did best: prepare. She was not under any illusion that the hearing would be simple. Crow had hired 2 lawyers from Helena and a third from Billings, men whose entire professional existence was built around making straightforward fraud look like a complicated series of misunderstandings. Marcia's cooperation had given the investigation a foundation, but cooperation statements from lawyers who were themselves legally exposed had a way of getting complicated in court. Crow would challenge the Meridian filing as administrative error. He would challenge the pattern argument by attacking each transaction individually. He would make the case that the Callahan debt was legitimate, that the engagement arrangement was standard practice, and that a 24-year-old ranch woman with a tin box full of county records was not a credible architect of a legal conspiracy theory. She knew all of this. She had been thinking about all of this since the gathering, so she spent those 6 weeks building the case that the court would actually need, which was different from the case she'd presented at the gathering. At the gathering, she'd needed to break Crow's public standing. In court, she needed to break his legal structure, and those were 2 different problems requiring 2 different kinds of work. She wrote to the Helena Record Office and requested the full corporate filing history for Meridian Cattle Works going back to its founding. She wrote to the Garner widow, a woman named Estelle Garner who had moved to Butte after losing her property and who Hartwell's investigation had located, and asked if she would be willing to provide a sworn statement. She spent 3 evenings drafting a detailed timeline that laid the Pembroke, Whitehill, and Callahan situations side by side and showed the structural similarities not as coincidence but as method. She did all of this in the evenings, after the ranch work was done, at the table in her room with the lamp burning and the tin box open beside her. Wyatt had gone back to the Blackthorn property for most of this period. He needed to, and she didn't begrudge it. He had his own operation and his own family situation to manage, including a father who was processing a significant revision of his understanding of a man he'd trusted. He wrote letters. Short ones, practical in content, but she read them carefully and found things between the lines that she did not examine too closely because the timing was wrong and she had enough to manage. She wrote back. Shorter, also practical. Lydia read one of them over her shoulder once and said nothing, which from Lydia communicated a great deal. Though Graham Callahan changed slowly, the way the things that matter change, not in a single moment, but in accumulation. He did not become a different man. He was too old and too set in his patterns for that, and Violet would not have trusted it if he had. What he became over those 6 weeks was a man who had stopped pretending he knew things he didn't know and stopped dismissing information that made him uncomfortable. It started with small things. He began asking her questions at the breakfast table, not about the household, but about the ranch. What was the water table reading this week? What did she think about moving the south herd before the first frost? Whether the east fence section she'd been planning to replace should use the heavier gauge? She answered. He listened. He didn't always agree, and when he disagreed, he said so, which was better than pretending she hadn't spoken. One morning in late September, he came into the barn and found her cross-referencing the grazing rotation with the rainfall record she kept in a separate ledger, and he stood watching her for a moment before she looked up. "You've been keeping rainfall records," he said, "for 4 years." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that." "I know you didn't." He pulled over the spare stool, the same stool Wyatt had used months ago in the tack room, and sat down heavily in the way of a man whose knees bothered him more than he admitted. "The ledger I keep in the barn office," he said. "The loan documents. You found the letter in there." "Yes." "I should have told you, both of you." He was looking at the floor, not at her. "I kept thinking I'd find a way to resolve it before it became something that needed to be explained." She waited. She had learned over a lifetime of watching her father that pushing at him before he'd finished arriving at something only sent him back the way he'd come. "I did the same thing with the debt that I did with everything else," he said. "I made it mine to handle alone. I didn't—" He stopped. "I've been doing that my whole life, treating this ranch like it was something I had to protect everyone else from instead of something we were all living together." Violet set the rainfall ledger down. "You treated me like help," she said. It came out plainly, without the weight of accusation, which surprised her a little. She had thought, when this conversation eventually happened, that it would carry more anger. What it carried instead was something older and more tired than anger. Not like family, like someone who handled the things nobody else wanted to deal with. He flinched. It was small, but she saw it. "Yes," he said. "I did. I needed you to see me," she said. "For years. Not what I did. Me." He looked up at her then. His face was not doing the closed, managed thing it usually did. It was doing something rawer than that, something that cost him in a way she could see. "I know," he said. "I know that now." It was not enough. She was not going to tell him it was enough when it wasn't, but it was the first true thing he had said to her in a very long time, and true things, even incomplete ones, have a weight that is different from everything else. "Start seeing me now," she said. "That's all I'm asking." He nodded. His hands, folded on his knees, were the hands of an old man. She noticed that, and the noticing carried its own complicated feeling. "The court hearing," he said. I want to be there." "You should be. As your father, not as the person who made the decision about Lydia, not as the one running things." He met her eyes. "As your father, if that's—" He stopped. "If you want me there in that way." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I want you there." He nodded again, and the small muscle in his jaw loosened slightly, and he stood up and went back to whatever he'd been doing before. She sat for a while after he left. Then she picked up the rainfall ledger and went back to work. Estelle Garner's sworn statement arrived in the first week of October, 4 days before the hearing. Violet read it at the kitchen table while Lydia made coffee, and the morning was still gray outside. Estelle Garner was 61 years old and had run her ranch alone for 11 years after her husband died, and she wrote the way people write when they have been holding something a long time and are finally setting it down. In plain sentences with no ornamentation, each fact placed carefully after the last. The Garner Ranch had been 800 acres. She'd borrowed from Crow Lending during a drought year when the cattle were thin and the bank in town had turned her down. The loan had seemed reasonable. The interest had accumulated faster than she'd expected. When she'd asked Crow's office to review the instrument, the man she'd dealt with, Marsh, had told her the structure was standard and she had no grounds to challenge it. She'd lost the property 14 months after the loan. She'd moved to Butte and taken in sewing work and tried for 2 years not to think about the land. The last paragraph of her statement said, "I am 61 years old. I do not expect to get my land back. But if what I know helps someone else keep theirs, I am willing to say it in any room that will hear it. I have been quiet long enough." Violet folded the statement carefully and put it at the front of the stack. "Good?" Lydia said, setting a cup of coffee in front of her. "Yes," Violet said. "Good." The hearing was held in the county courthouse in Billings, in a room that smelled of wood varnish and old paper and the particular weight of decisions made in formal settings. It was not a large room, but it was full. The judge was a territorial circuit judge named Aldous Fenn, who had been doing this work for 22 years and had the face of a man who had heard most things and remained interested in hearing the rest. Crow's 3 lawyers occupied one side of the room. They were well-dressed and well-prepared, and they radiated the particular confidence of men who had won by attrition before and intended to do so again. On the other side sat the county lawyer working with Hartwell's office, a younger man named Prescott, who was thorough and unshowy and had spent the previous 3 weeks going through every document Violet had provided with the focused attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. Violet sat behind Prescott, her father on one side, Lydia on the other. Wyatt, who had arrived from the Blackthorn property the evening before with Caleb and their father Edward, sat 2 rows back with the Whitehill documentation in a leather folder on his knee. Daniel Whitehill was there. Estelle Garner had made the journey from Butte. Silas Crow sat behind his lawyers in a dark coat and said nothing. The hearing ran for 6 hours across 2 days. Crow's lawyers did exactly what she had expected. They challenged the Meridian filing as clerical error. They challenged the pattern argument as speculation. They challenged the Whitehill and Pembroke comparisons as separate transactions with separate legal contexts. They challenged Marsh's cooperation statement on the grounds that a man testifying to reduce his own exposure was a man with reason to say whatever served him. Prescott was patient. He laid the documents in sequence. He let the pattern speak rather than arguing for it dramatically. He understood, as Violet had understood, that argument invites counterargument, but evidence laid plainly invites the observer to reach their own conclusion. He read the matching language from the 3 debt instruments. He walked through the Meridian filing dates against the debt default dates and showed the court that in every case, Pembroke, Whitehill, Garner, the Meridian registration had been filed before the formal transfer, before any judgment, sometimes before the default was even formally declared. He read Estelle Garner's statement into the record. Daniel Whitehill testified for 40 minutes. He was not polished. He stumbled on some of the dates and had to be corrected by his own documents twice. He cried once, briefly, when he talked about his brother's son asking why they had to leave the land, and he didn't apologize for it, just stopped for a moment and then kept talking. The crying, Violet thought, was more persuasive than any argument could have been. It was not performed. It was a man in his 40s sitting in a formal room telling a judge what had been done to his family, and the rawness of it was the realest thing in the room. On the second day, Judge Fenn asked Crow's lawyers a series of questions about the Meridian filing timeline that they could not answer to his visible satisfaction. He asked for a recess. During the recess, Violet stood in the corridor outside the courtroom and looked out the window at the street below. Wyatt came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a while, which she'd come to understand was one of his better qualities. Fenn is going to rule on the filing, she said. I don't know about the larger fraud case. That'll go to the territorial court and take months. But the Meridian filing on our land, the injunction, I think he rules on that today. You sound certain. I sound like someone who's been reading documents for 6 weeks and has run out of patience for uncertainty, she said. He almost laughed. She almost did too. Whatever happens today, Wyatt said, you should know. What you built here, the case, the way you put it together. He stopped. He was not a man who reached for language when he wasn't sure it would land right. I've met a lot of people in this business who are smart. You're the first one I've met who is smart about the right things. She looked at him. The corridor was quiet around them. Somewhere back in the courtroom, a clerk was organizing papers. The right things, she said. Things that matter, he said. Things that protect people, not just assets, people. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you, she said. It came out simply, which was the right way for it to come out. He nodded. They went back inside. Judge Fenn's ruling that afternoon was narrow in the way good legal rulings are narrow. It addressed what it could address firmly and deferred what required more process to the appropriate channel. He ruled the Meridian Cattle Works filing on the Callahan property invalid. He found that registering an interest in property not legally acquired constituted a fraudulent claim under territorial property law and ordered the filing expunged from the county record. He extended the injunction on the Callahan land indefinitely pending the outcome of the broader fraud investigation. He referred the full case, the pattern of transactions across the Pembroke, Whitehill, Garner, and Callahan families, to the territorial court in Helena with a formal recommendation for investigation of systematic lending fraud. He noted, in language that was dry and precise and therefore devastating, that the consistency of documentation presented by the county suggested this was not a matter of individual errors in judgment, but of deliberate and repeated practice. He did not rule on the Callahan debt itself. That would come later, through the debt challenge Prescott was filing separately. But he ruled on the thing that mattered most immediately. The land was not Crow's. The land was not Meridian Cattle Works. The land was the Callahans. When Fenn left the bench, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Graham Callahan, sitting beside his eldest daughter, put his hand on the table in front of him and pressed it flat against the wood as if he needed to feel something solid, and exhaled a breath that seemed to come from a very long way down. Lydia reached across and covered his hand with hers. Violet sat still and looked at the front of the room where Prescott was gathering his papers. and let what had just happened settle into her without rushing it. Across the room, Crow and his lawyers were already in low, rapid conference. One of them was making notes. Another was headed for the door. Crow himself stood for a moment with his hands at his sides and his face doing nothing at all, and then he looked across the room and his eyes found Violet. She held his gaze. She did not smirk. She did not look triumphant. She looked at him the way she looked at the water rotation schedule or the rainfall ledger. Steadily, with the attention of a person who has understood something completely and is not particularly surprised to have been right about it. He looked away first. She turned back to her family. Silas Crow's formal indictment came 4 months later, out of Helena. It covered the Pembroke, Whitehill, and Garner transactions, and named Reginald Marsh as a co-defendant. The Callahan situation was folded in as part of the pattern, but the attempted transfer had been stopped before completion, which meant the legal weight fell differently. It became evidence of intent rather than completed crime, which was in some ways more damning. Violet read the newspaper account of the indictment at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in February, with frost on the windows and a cup of coffee going cold beside her hand. She read it twice. She felt something that was not quite satisfaction because satisfaction implied an uncomplicated ending, and nothing about this had been uncomplicated. It felt more like the particular quiet that comes when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you finally put it down. Not lightness, just the absence of a weight. The Callahan debt challenge was resolved 3 weeks after the indictment. The territorial court, working from Prescott's filings and the documentation from the fraud case, ruled that the debt instrument contained provisions that violated territorial lending law and reduced the principal by 60%. The remaining balance was restructured at a fixed rate over 7 years. It was manageable. For the first time in 6 years, it was manageable. Graham signed the new agreement at the kitchen table with Violet and Lydia present. He had asked them both to be there. He signed it and pushed the paper across the table and sat back in his chair and looked at his daughters with the expression of a man who was still learning how to see what had been in front of him all along. "The north fence," he said. "I looked at it this morning. The section you repaired last spring is holding better than the contractor's work from 2 years back." Violet looked at him. "The heavier gauge holds better in winter." "I know that now," he said. "I should have known it earlier." It was not an apology precisely, but it was its own kind of thing, and she accepted it as that. Spring came late that year, as it often did in Montana, dragging its feet through March and not arriving in earnest until the last week of April. When it did come, it came all at once. The grass going green overnight, the creek running high and cold, the cattle moving differently in the pastures the way they did when the season shifted under them. Violet was checking the northwest water flow, the creek that ran off the Halverson property, the same one she'd protected with the water rights challenge 2 years before she ever knew Silas Crow's name. When she heard a horse in the yard behind her, she knew before she turned around. She'd heard that particular horse enough times by now. Wyatt tied his horse at the rail and came across the yard without hurrying, which was how he did most things. He was wearing working clothes that had been worked in, same as the first day. She found she preferred him that way. "Caleb said the creek's running well this year," he said. "It is." She held up the flow measurement notebook. "Up from last year." He looked at the numbers she'd been recording. He'd gotten better at reading them over the past several months. Not because she'd formally taught him, but because he'd kept showing up and kept asking the right questions and kept writing down what she told him. They had been doing this, the back and forth of it, the letters, the visits, the working alongside each other, for almost a year now. It had not been declared or formally discussed. It had simply grown in the space between two people who were honest with each other, which was the only way anything real grew. "I talked to my father," Wyatt said, "and your father, about the land boundary between the North Blackthorn parcel and your east grazing section." She had been thinking about that boundary herself. The two properties shared a fence line of about half a mile that was technically double maintained, but practically maintained by whoever got to it first, which was usually her. "What about it?" she said. "They've agreed to discuss a formal grazing agreement for the shared boundary," he said. "Documented, filed with the county, the right way." She looked at him. "Whose idea was that?" "Mine," he said. with some input from a woman I know who thinks everything should be documented and filed with the county. She's right. She usually is, he said. It's mildly irritating. She almost smiled. The almost was doing less work than it used to. There's something else, he said. She waited. My family's buying the Aldrin property, he said, the north section. It borders your east pasture on the other side. With both parcels, the Blackthorn operation and the Callahan operation share boundaries on 3 sides. She understood what he was saying, not just the geographic fact of it, but the larger shape it implied. 2 ranches operating in proximity, with shared boundaries and formal agreements, and a history of working together through a situation that had tested both of them. That was not a small thing on the Montana frontier. That was the foundation of something. Is that a business proposal? She said. Among other things, he said. Eventually. She looked at him steadily. You're going to have to be more specific than eventually. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the creek, then back at her. I'd like to keep showing up, he said, to this ranch, to you. Formally, if you want it formal, or not, if you don't. But I'd like it to be a thing that's acknowledged rather than a thing we go on not quite naming. It was not a sweeping declaration. It was not ornate. It was a man telling her plainly what he wanted and asking what she wanted, which was exactly the right way to do it, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. I want the grazing agreement documented first, she said. He waited. And I want my name on it, she said. Not my father's. Mine. Done, he said without hesitation. And I want to be asked, she said, not arranged, not decided for, not managed into something for someone else's reasons. Asked. By you. When the time comes. Violet, he said quietly. That's the only way I'd do it. She believed him. That was the thing she had not quite let herself fully acknowledge yet, that she believed him, specifically, in the way you believe people who have shown you over the course of months and difficulty and small daily interactions what they are actually made of. She had watched him cross a room to stand in a doorway for her. She had watched him write to his brother and ride before dawn and sit in a tack room until 2 a.m. reading other people's documents. She had watched him ask his father to look at a woman his family had been willing to overlook, and she had watched him do all of it without asking her to be grateful for it. She turned back to the creek and finished recording the flow measurement. The east fence section, she said, the one that needs replacing before summer. I'll send 2 of our hands next week, he said, if you want them. I want them, she said, and I want the heavier gauge. I know, he said. You always want the heavier gauge. Ben, the thing about a life built in the margins, in the space between what other people see and what's actually holding things together, is that it teaches you a specific and not particularly comfortable truth. The work that matters most is rarely the work that gets noticed first. The fence that doesn't fail doesn't make news. The water rights that stay secured don't become a story. The debt that gets caught before it collapses is just another year the ranch survived, and everyone credits the weather or the cattle prices or luck. Violet had spent 8 years doing work that functioned best when nobody saw it. She had built that into a skill, and, if she was honest with herself, into a kind of protection. If nobody saw the work, nobody could take it from her. If nobody knew what she was doing, nobody could tell her to stop. What she had not understood until the night she stood in the Fenwick barn with a stack of county records in her hands and 300 people in front of her was that invisibility has a cost beyond the obvious one. It's not just that you don't get credit, it's that you begin to believe the invisibility is necessary. That the only way to keep doing the thing that matters is to keep doing it unseen. That the moment you step into the light, the thing itself becomes vulnerable. She had been wrong about that. Or not entirely wrong, but wrong enough. The work she'd done in secret had built the foundation. But the work she'd done in public, the documents, the gathering, the hearing, the months of formal process, had built something else. Not just legal protection for the land, but a different understanding of what she was. Not just by her father, not just by this county, by herself. She was not done learning how to be seen. It was uncomfortable in ways she hadn't predicted, and she suspected it would remain uncomfortable in ways she couldn't yet predict. She had spent too long in the margins to simply step out of them without tripping on her own habits. But she was working on it. By the following summer, the Callahan Ranch had its name on 8 documents filed with the county that had not existed 2 years earlier. Water agreements, grazing permissions, land boundary formalization, updated tax registrations, a livestock certification that had been filed under Graham's name for 15 years and was now filed under both of them. Graham had suggested the joint filing himself. He had come to her one morning with the existing registration in his hand and said, "I'd like to redo this." She had looked at him and not asked why, because she knew why, and he knew she knew. And sometimes the acknowledgement of a thing does not require speech. She filed it with both names on a Thursday afternoon in Billings, at the same county clerk's office where she'd spent 4 days reading water rights documents 6 years ago. The clerk who processed it was a young woman who looked up from the paperwork with the expression of someone who was supposed to move quickly through the day's filings, but had noticed something. "Violet Callahan," she said. Violet looked at her. "You're the one who brought the case against Crow," the clerk said, "last fall." "Yes." The woman held her gaze for a moment. She was perhaps 20, with ink-stained fingers and the focused look of someone taking her work seriously. "My family has a small operation," she said, "up near Roundup. My father looked into a loan from Crow Lending last year. He didn't take it in the end, but—" She stopped. "I just wanted you to know that he didn't take it because someone told him to look more carefully, after what happened here." Violet looked at her for a moment. "Good," she said. "He should look carefully at everything." "He does now," the woman said. She processed the filing. "Congratulations on the joint registration." Violet picked up her copy and walked out into the afternoon. The street in front of the county building was busy with the ordinary movement of a summer day. People going about work that had nothing to do with her or her family or Silas Crow or 412 acres of Montana land. She stood on the step for a moment and let the sun sit on her face and did not think about anything in particular. She thought about her grandfather, who she had never met, who had broken raw ground with a team of oxen. She thought about what he'd wanted when he did it. Not legacy, probably, not history. Probably just a place that stayed. She thought about Estelle Garner in Butte, taking in sewing work, about Daniel Whitehill's nephew, who was 12 now and living in Wyoming and had never gone back to the land where he was born. You cannot fix everything. You cannot go back and undo the losses that happened before you knew to stop them. There was a particular grief in that, which she carried and intended to keep carrying, because putting it down would mean pretending those losses were not real. What you can do is pay attention. Document what matters. Learn the tools that are used against people and learn them better than the people using them. Stand up in rooms when it's necessary, even when, especially when, nobody expects you to. And find, if you're fortunate, a few people who will stand beside you while you do it. Not people who will do it for you, people who will show up and read the documents and ask the right questions and be honest with you about what they see. She had those people now. She had not always had them, and she did not take the having of them lightly. The afternoon was long and warm, and the ride home would take her past the east pasture where the new fence line ran clean and solid, heavier gauge, built to last. She walked to her horse, mounted, and rode.